A Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashem, Makakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I'm not really sure what I might title it, but this are just a couple um, uh, um, things that I've noticed, diving into many books. And I kind of just wanted to expound on something that I've noticed in regards to myself when it comes to going into and reading different books, and things to also be mindful of, especially, as a younger brother. And the one of the first things, diving into, when I say other books, I kind of mean like other books that go into a lot of our history, but it might be covering different topics such as Dark Ages, or it might be covering, different, history in regards to different tribes. And so a lot of factual, information. And one of the things, I've learned, going into a lot of these different books is the fact that, as well, let me read it. I want to read it, because King Solomon really and truly, said it best. But sometimes within our um within our zeal, in the beginning of understanding and knowing who we are, and wanting to know more about our history, we tend to dive into all these different books and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to sound like a hypocrite, because I've done it, and realizing and just learning how to essentially pull back and then go into more what's it called, like um more milk like topics, and staying, sticking and remaining, within the scriptures, to for, just to ensure. And it also, it really basically ensures proper, child development, right? Because the scriptures is really, giving you, it's a lot more, sufficient for your development, right? um Something I was actually meditating on this morning, is that, as children, you want to ensure that that child gets, enough, nutrients. You want to ensure that that child gets the proper care. If you had a physical child, that is, when that child is born, you want to make sure that child, the child gets fed, the child is warm, the child is clothed, the child is taken care of. you know the child is properly, instructed. And a lot of these different, books, they will offer essentially a more information, but it doesn't actually offer you a well-rounded amount of information. When I say information, I'm saying in a sense that it's not offering you templates, of like how, certain forefathers might act, exemplified certain characteristics and so on and so forth. And that's why the scriptures say that the things that are written aforetime are written for our learning, and in the scriptures, you get all of that, right? So this is, I guess, a bit of a self-reflection, and understanding that, you're not gonna get, certain development, certain fruits of the spirit. You're not gonna get that in a lot of these other books, right? Is it extra information to know? Then I'm not knocking it, but I'm just saying, just to be mindful of it, because I was the type of person that, was diving deep into many other, from going from one book to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. And doing so can cause you to be a child that's underdeveloped. And when I say underdeveloped, I'm saying that in the sense of, it can lead you to, to be nourished in one sense, but you're kind of lacking, in other areas, right? So you can also ask yourself, if you're that type of person, that likes to, dive in, into these other, books, right? Are you, does it, can, is this also leading me to being malnourished? Am I also, lacking in other areas, acquiring all this information, right? So a little bit, this is a type of lesson that it kind of requires a little bit of self-examination also, right? And knowing, okay, maybe I need to establish a certain level of temperance, not to go too far into it where I'm lacking in certain, other areas, right? Whether it might be temperance, whether it might be patience or brotherly kindness or whatever it is, right? So I want to get a couple precepts on this. I kind of ramble quite a bit. I don't exactly have a title for the lesson, but I sincerely pray and hope this is edifying, right? So I'll start off with something that King Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, the 12th chapter, and this is verse 12, and it says, "And further by these, my son, be admonished of the making of many books. There is no end, and much study. And much study is a weariness of the flesh. And let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear the Most High Yahweh and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." Right. So just there's so much. It's like it's so much information, and the scriptures gives you exactly what you need, right? And also, I mentioned a point in regards to just give me 1 second. My laptop's a little frozen. Right, Salakia for my laptop is just a little bit frozen, but I kind of wanted to read a little bit about this something called colostrum, because I was mentioning the importance of child development, and being younger, you might have a lot of zeal to, you constantly want to know more and so on and so forth, right? But you don't want to become, malnourished at the objective of trying to get to know more, right? Um, so I wanted to. This is a bit of a far out point, but just bear with me as I make this point here. This is I'm reading this. This is called colostrum. So colostrum is basically the first milk your body produces during pregnancy. So when a woman is pregnant, this is the kind of milk her body is producing, and it says, and it forms your mammary glands, breasts, and plays an important role in the building of baby's immune system. If you plan on breastfeeding, nursing the first milk your baby will get from the breasts. It says, if you don't want to breastfeed, okay, the point is here. It says it's high in proteins, vitamins, minerals, immuno immunoglobulins, which are antibodies, and it says it helps to build the baby's immune system. It is often described as liquid gold because it's often rich golden color and valuable in benefits, right? So you might be thinking, okay, Raquai, why exactly? Oh, hold on. It says what kind of nutrients are in colostrum. So here it says, it lists off immunoglobulin, which is an antibody. It says lactoferrin, which is a protein that helps to prevent infection. It says leukocytes, which are white blood cells. It says epidermal growth factor. It says a protein that stimulates cell growth. It says it gets its color from carotenoids, an antioxidant, and vitamin A, and it plays a vital role in the baby's vision, skin, and immune system. Colostrum is rich in magnesium, which supports the health baby's heart and bones, copper and zinc, right? And those are different nutrients you might get, like in eating different legumes like nuts and so on and so forth. You know, um, let's see. Okay, so it says here, what is the difference between colostrum and breast milk? So it's filled with 2 times as much protein, 4 times as much zinc, lower in fat and in sugar and easier to digest. It says thicker and more yellow. It says is filled with immunoglobulins, which are the antibodies to boost the baby's immune system and protect it from illness. So it basically is like a one-stop shop, right? It covers, all the different aspects of your development, right? So I'm kind of using this to kind of equate this in a spiritual sense in regards to the scriptures, because it's giving you a one-stop shop on covering everything that we really need to know, right? Not to say that, if it's within your spirit to, want to know more about, certain periods of history and so on and so forth, but I'm just making the observation that, when you do dive into these other things, you're not gonna get all these well-rounded nutrients, right? Because you're also digesting these books too. That's another thing when you think about it in a spiritual sense. You're also digesting these other books, right? And you're not gonna get all those well-rounded nutrients. You're not gonna get, certain aspects of the scriptures that the scriptures is actually giving you for your proper development, right? So what I want to do, I'll go back to, where was I? Okay, this is Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6. And it says, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it, right? So, earlier, you might think, okay, in one aspect, you can think about, an actual child being trained up. But, as, when we come into this understanding, we also learn that, we're also likened unto children, right? That are properly, being guided, because the ways of the world, of how we learned how to do things, we learned how to maneuver, we learned how to relate with each other, we learned how to, operate with a certain vibration and conduct, is that is constantly being refurbished and being broken, right? We're trying to, put off those old ways, right? So we are also as, when, like, I'm just using this as, when you're younger in the faith, right? We're also putting off a lot of those old ways, because a lot of those old ways that we learn, they weren't really conducive to life. The way we handle certain problems, the way we problem solve, the way we, spoke to, for example, we communicated with our parents, the way we relate with elders, we would relate with, maybe people in authority, we really resolved conflict, the way we, handled and dealt with our emotional state of mind, all these different aspects of how we were navigating in the world, it wasn't beneficial. It wasn't helping. Some of us probably had an anger problem. Some of us probably, we talked back to the parents, you know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like the point is, we were trained up in a way that wasn't, proper, that wasn't right, because we weren't, we didn't, the Lord didn't open up our minds for this understanding, at that time. But, having the understanding now would literally being trained up again. So we are also likened unto those children, diving into this milk, right? The milk is just, it, like I was reading earlier, it's very, very beneficial. I can't tell you how many times, you know, like, for example, because I did a lesson recently in regards to, how to dealing with your father. And I can't tell you how many times, like, for example, patience was one of the things that I had to learn when you relate, with elderly, when you relate with fathers, because my father's up in age. And to be honest with you, knowing those basic things, it helped me to understand a suffering, because that's something you have to it's suffering, but you learn how to be patient, because I understand that his mental strength isn't where my mental strength is. So I had to, you had to just learn to adjust, right? Because our people, they operate in a vibration that it's essentially selfish, as opposed to when you come into this understanding, you learn to be a bit more selfless. You learn to be a bit more considerate. You learn to consider your brother. You learn to consider others. What I'm saying, like, that's really the point. So that goes back into breaking off and remolding that old man and being trained up in the child as a child that is being properly groomed, the way the Lord actually wants us to be. That's actually more pleasing, because the way we were living before, it wasn't in a pleasing sense. It was a sense that, we were essentially the degenerates of a strange vine, right? Like it says that in Jeremiah, the second chapter. So, you know, um, let me go to. I wanted to read this in Luke. Hold on. Um, excuse me. Okay. I wanted to just read this here because it gives you, this account kind of gives you like a little bit of something that Yahweh Shai strongly exemplified, and it's so healthy for child development. You know what I'm saying? Knowing like these different fruits of the spirit is so important, of how we actually conduct ourselves, right? To promote good conduct. When you look at the way our people grow up, in the world, it's not a way that is essentially conducive to life, right? Um, so this is Luke chapter 22, verse 24. And it says, then, I'm reading in the NLT, so it says, then they began to argue amongst themselves about who would be the greatest among them. And Yahushua told them and says, in this world the kings and great men lord it over their people, yet they are called friends of the people. But among you it will be different. Those who are in the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leader should be like a servant. For who is more important, the one who sits at the table or the one who serves? The one who sits at the table, of course, but not here. For I am among you as one who serves. So so showing you, how Shai is, explaining like, I am among the ones, who serve. And servitude is really what Yahweh Shai is strongly, exemplified, right? And one of the ways that, he showed them was actually by washing the disciples' feet. So the the different examples, the different accounts of our different forefathers, you know the way they exemplify certain acts of righteousness, is very, it's also very important for child development. I'm just using Yahweh Shai, his statement, as an example of um exemplifying certain fruits of the Spirit, because, going into as if you're the type of person like myself, you enjoy, the information, it's great, but, there's more to your development that you're probably not paying attention to, right? So this is a bit of a self-examination also, like, okay, I might be putting a lot of energy into this one avenue, but am I neglecting certain other things? Can I actually pay more attention and exemplify certain fruits of the Spirit? And, because sometimes the Lord would, honestly, if I'm being completely honest, the Lord would definitely put us in situations where we have to exemplify those different situations, right? Those different fruits of the Spirit, right? Because it's one thing to know a lot of this information, and it's another thing to, okay, you're not, the most charitable person or whatever, or, you got like an anger problem or whatever, right? If the shoe fits, wear it, right? Because I'm kind of just making this lesson because I'm just explaining the mistake that I've made, right? And this is something that I've learned, you know. um there was oh, here, okay. Let me go to the Apocrypha real quick. Okay, this is Sirach chapter 37, verse 27, and it says, "My son, prove thy soul in thy life, and see what is evil for it, and give not that unto it. For all things are not profitable for all men, neither hath every soul pleasure in anything. Be not unsatiable in any dainty thing, nor too greedy upon meats. For excess meats bringeth sickness, and surfeiting will turn into choler," right? So yes, it can be speaking about something that is very in a physical sense, not to be too greedy upon meat. But this was one of the mistakes I've made in regards to being greedy upon meats when it comes to actual information. Not to say that I wasn't, I didn't share, but I'm just saying in the sense of, it can bring sickness because you acquire so much of this information, and it can lead to a different type of sickness where essentially you become very, very puffed up, right? You feel like you can't be, corrected, and so on and so forth, right? So this can lead to other, you see where I'm going with this? It can lead to another type of sickness, right? A good example of that pride is when you read in Chronicles, there was a king. He was doing very, very, well. He was righteous. He was following the prophet, and his name was Uzziah. And when you go through his story, he had a lot of success. So essentially, the Lord gave him cunning knowledge to be able to, create, different weapons, and he was a lover of husbandry, right? So, and there was a point within his rulership where he became a little bit like puffed up, right? So, and then he began to burn incense, um right, in the I believe it was in the temple, if I'm not mistaken. And a band of 80 priests came and they stopped him because when you go through within like in the priesthood, the incense wasn't reserved for kings. That was a duty that was reserved and consecrated for the priests only, right? And he was wroth, right, when he was stopped, right? And so basically the Lord intervened and smote him with leprosy, right? So the point is, he had a good reign of actually being a good king, but he became very puffed up, right? And just like the excess of all this information and all these meats can lead us to being puffed up also. So these are just things to self-examine and be mindful of. This is a lot of what's it called, basically just self-examination, right? and making sure you develop and making sure your development is proper, right? You're not like malnourished. You're not like, you have too much on one side, and you're neglecting certain other nutrients, and I'm using nutrients as an example for, different traits and different fruits of the spirit and so on and so forth, like Paul talks about, right? um there was one more I wanted to hit. um we're at 25. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I'm just gonna read this real quick. This is Second Peter chapter 1 verse 5. And it says, in view of all of this, I'm reading in the NLT, it says, make every effort to respond to the Most High's promise. Supplement your faith with a generous provision of moral excellence with knowledge, and with knowledge self-control, and with self-control patient endurance, and patient endurance with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and with brotherly affection with love for everyone, right? So, well, you're showing, that amongst the brothers, right? But the point is, you know, just ensuring that we grow in the right way and not malnourishing ourselves, right? As essentially a scapegoat to avoid, working on other aspects, right? So, that's pretty much it. But I really sincerely pray that this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. Until next time, I say Shalom.